Hello, and welcome to Coronavirus, the Whole Story. I'm Vivienne Parry, and once upon a time, I was a student here at UCL. Today, I'm a writer, broadcaster, and the lucky person that gets to host this UCL Minds podcast. I've been talking to some of the amazing UCL community using their skills and expertise to understand coronavirus and to try and combat its impact. Over the last 3 months, I've spoken to psychologists, engineers, and historians, to name just a few of the dizzying array of experts this place has on hand, about every possible aspect of the pandemic, from the best way to make a mask, to how to map the spread of the virus, to how to build life-saving technology. You can hear all 12 of our previous episodes wherever you found this one. My guests this week are an education scholar, a paediatrician, and a teacher. And as you might have guessed, our topic of discussion is children and how they've been affected by coronavirus. My first guest is Dr. Lee Hudson, who's a clinical associate professor and honorary consultant general paediatrician in the Gosh UCL Institute of Child Health. He specialises in teen health, especially their mental health, with an interest in eating disorders. I'm also joined by Dr. Amelia Roberts, a principal teaching fellow in the IOE, who leads on the knowledge exchange programme SWIRL, which stands for Supporting Wellbeing, Emotional Regulation and Learning, and whose research helps create learning that's more accessible and inclusive. My third guest this week is Shafina Vohra, and we've been debating whether to let her in because she's a PhD student at Imperial, but we are going to let her onto this podcast because she is an IOE alumna. She's also a psychology teacher and faculty leader, and she's researching education through boundary objects. But perhaps she'll tell us about that a bit later. I'm going to start, though, with Lee. Can you outline the ways that lockdown has impacted children and young people?
Sure. So I think the first thing to do is to start with a contrast of how the infection itself has affected children and young people. We've got enough data now and experience to know that while some children do get unwell with COVID, the vast majority of children actually do not seem to be infected at all. And so I think it's interesting to reflect as an age group compared to other age groups that the major impact that COVID is likely to have is on mental health and also broader aspects of their health. Obviously, the pandemic's been around for around 6 months internationally now, and in Europe for 3 months. The data is not entirely clear. The data we have is mostly cross-sectional, so at one point in time. But what seems to be clear from different settings in the world, including some reports that have come out from the UK, is that it seems to be the younger children, so the 4 to 10-year-olds, who seem to be affected more, and they seem to be affected in multiple ways with emotional difficulties, more unhappy and more worried. There's also some evidence that their parents are affected as well. And then, of course, people live in systems and exist in systems, and so those things can be difficult for both ages. Interestingly, teenagers, at least in one study from Oxford University, the CoSpace study shows that teenagers actually probably haven't done as badly. You could speculate about why that might be. They're not in school at the moment, and the pressures that are around when you're 15 and 16. So it's the younger children that have really been affected. The slightly older 16 to 24-year-olds, that they seem to have been affected by anxiety as well, and that's a big problem from the data we have. So I think overall, it's going to be mental health, and it's going to be things like the way that the economy and the way that lack of education is going to affect this generation. And that's what I'm really worried about.
So, how about physical health? Because a lot of children have literally had to be stuck inside for a very long time. Are we worried about the consequences of not having enough exercise for children? Because exercise isn't just something that it's a nice to have. It's actually very important developmentally as well, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's, the idea that you can separate the body and the mind. That I think most people now realise that's not how it works. And exercise and physical activity and getting out and about is really quite important for mental health as well as physical health, and they play off each other. I mean, thankfully, we are coming out of lockdown now, and so the period of time has been quite short. But certainly, children and young people definitely have had less physical activity. That will affect their mental health. It almost certainly will have affected a significant proportion of children and young people's um, uh, BMI, their body weight, and their health over time. And we know that um, cumulative gaining weight in children in a bad way it sets people off on a trajectory. So it's likely that has affected things. I mean, one of the really interesting things about eating that's come out of the UCOPE study, which is a study that's been joint between UCL and Imperial, looking at 16 to 24-year-olds, is that a significant number of young people have been overeating, as they would describe it, in response to stress. So as well as the reduction in physical activity, we're also likely to see some impact on the way that people have been eating in response to stress and emotions, which we know is quite common with those emotions.
Yeah, the fact that you haven't been able to get flour for a very long time because everybody was doing home baking should probably tell you that that flour had to be turned into cakes and biscuits, which had to be eaten by somebody. So there's been a lot of eating that's going on, and of course for little children, meeting other children is actually part of their social development and also part of their brain's development. I mean, they need to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, people are often critical of social media. Like all things, social media and the internet use has got some very bad problems, but some also very good ones. So I think we are lucky, and children and young people are lucky, if you could use that word, to be in a generation where at least we are networked and we can still see and talk to friends, and they can still see and talk to their schools in some cases. Whereas if this had happened 10, 15 years ago, that would have been very different. But absolutely, there's no compensation for not seeing children, not seeing each other. And I've got three young children myself, and as they've some of them have gone back to school and they've been interacting with their peers more directly, you can visibly see the impact that's had upon them.
So let's look at the future now. Now that lockdown is ending, I mean, I know that parents are praying. Most parents are praying to get their children back to school in September. But what kind of impacts do you think the past few months could have on children in the long term, health wise?
Well, I think it's going to differ by different groups of children, really. I mean, some children will have probably managed to get through this short period of time, had some home education, have had potentially a bit more of a relaxed time. Maybe families have actually spent more time together in lockdown. So I don't think we can say it's all doom and gloom. However, there are certain groups of children that I do worry about, and I think a lot of people have commented on the fact that it's certain socioeconomic groups of children, families where we knew that education is important, who may not have been accessing education online. Children may not have had laptops or technology to be able to do that sort of thing. So I think there are certain groups, and my real big worry is that the poverty gap that was there already may have been affected significantly. And so that will have almost certainly impacted on certain groups of children more than others. I mean, the other uncertainty, of course, is we don't really know where we're going with COVID. I'm trying to be optimistic because I think we all should be, but we're far from out of it still. And we all hope that children will go back in September. And I believe sincerely that children should go back to school in September on balance for their well-being. But, we may well be in this for the long haul. And so those children that I've already talked about, and ultimately maybe all children, will continue to be affected as this goes on.
And it's interesting. I say lots of parents are desperate to get their children back to school, but the last poll that I saw, 25% of parents did not intend to send their children back to school in September. That's quite a large number of parents.
It is a large number, and I think this will be one of the challenges. I mean, clearly, the message about the danger of coronavirus and the importance of lockdown has got through effectively in lots of ways, and so that's changed the way that people think about it. I mean, certainly, as someone who is a parent and someone who looks after children, and also has looked after a significant proportion of the children who've had the post-inflammatory condition with COVID, and looked after children on a COVID ward, like I said earlier, the direct impact of the virus is very low. Um, so on balance, children should be in school, and some of them will children will get coronavirus. There's no evidence that they spread it more, but some of them will get coronavirus. So you can understand why some families are worried about the risk of their children, or potentially the risk that they will carry coronavirus back to their own families at home. So it's not a straightforward argument, but I would say, on all three of those, someone who's interested in epidemiology of child health, who looks after children and has my own children, I would say on balance there, and life is about risks, and we often have to make balanced judgments about risk for our children. Even every time you put a child into a car, you're making a risk judgment about, you might get into a car crash, and a significant greater number of children die in car crashes or road traffic accidents than have died from COVID. So, but we still will be using cars. So there is a risk issue, but that's very difficult and really hard for families. So I don't think anyone should condemn them on that at all. But I do worry about the long-term effects that will have socially.
Well, thank you very much. A running theme actually across this whole podcast series has been exploring how lockdown has affected different groups of people in different ways. And Lee's already mentioned this with children. Amelia, which groups of children have been most impacted by lockdown, and in what ways?
Yes, that's a great question. I mean, if we look at some of the OECD data, that's the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, they are most concerned about children in poverty, children with mental health difficulties or whose families have mental health issues. They are worried about children with special educational needs, or children who are in detention, or children who are in refugee scenarios. So, what we're really looking at is that any child who's in a situation of disadvantage is likely to be more affected by COVID-19. And the Sutton Trust did a report looking at social mobility in COVID-19. And some areas of real concern are the widening attainment gap in early years. And there's lots of reasons for that, but we know that building relationships with younger children, socialization skills, and also vocabulary and language skills have an ongoing impact on their school attainment and their lifelong chances. We also know that a third of families, this is reported also by the Sutton Trust, a third of families don't have a separate computer for children, which means that those children aren't going to be able to access learning in the same way. And from the same report, we also know that schools in richer areas, which in the UK is defined by children being on free school meals or not being on free school meals, the gap between schools that are able to broadcast lessons to children is actually 47% in richer areas and only 34% in poorer areas. And the schools in the poorer areas, only about half of those are accepting work remotely from children, compared to 75% in more affluent areas. So we're absolutely seeing an impact in terms of more vulnerable people and less vulnerable people being affected disproportionately by COVID-19. And I just want to flag up something else, but in terms of safeguarding and young people's mental health, we know that the organisation Refuge, that helps families who have experienced domestic violence, we know that there has been a 700% increase in calls. And a similar picture for the NSPCC Childline, their calls have gone up 300% from 545 to 2,274.
That is really scary, isn't it? Really
Yes,
scary.
it really is. So one of the issues that I think is really important to think about is that for some children, very sadly, their homes are not a particularly safe place to be. So when a child is trapped in a home environment that is dangerous or very, very stressful, then the impact of long-term stress on their mental health is significantly problematic. And that's one reason why moving children back into school really is a good idea for many, many young people.
The pressures that have been put on parents, guardians, and carers during the lockdown has been absolutely immense. If you don't have much space, you're sharing with other people, several other families, even in some cases. This is a huge pressure that parents know that they are facing these difficulties, but there's very little that they can do about them in order to help their children, which must be a terrible feeling.
I think it's been incredibly tough on families. I mean, typically families had 2 days of notice before lockdown. And so, whatever a family was juggling, whether it was work or newly working from home, suddenly having to homeschool as well, I think has been incredibly challenging. And many parents have been really worried about their children falling back in terms of education. And I think one of the messages that's really important to give is that many children will pick up on their learning when they go back into school. So we have concepts such as neuroplasticity, which talk about how the brain is very adaptable. And so for many children, when they go back into school, they will be able to pick up on their learning and pick up on their social skills. But here again, we have that gap between the advantaged and the disadvantaged. So the child that was already vulnerable, already falling behind, the impact on their confidence when they go back into school could be a significant factor. But I do think it's important to say that it's not all doom and gloom for parents. So one of our professors at the Institute of Education, Gemma Moss, has talked about a real increase in love of reading. There are other reports of children who are made very anxious by maths, being able to really get to grips with numerical concepts by using real life learning. You've got children with autism, and this comes from Dr. Georgia Pavlopoulou's research, children with autism whose anxiety may actually be decreased because they're not having to confront the outside world and conform to those expectations. Also, some people are reporting that relationship building has become stronger. So the picture isn't all black and white. We have to think of a nuanced picture in respect of COVID-19.
And for those children that experience bullying at school, this has been a welcome release.
Yes, I'll tell you why I'm tentative. This is again from the OECD, but they have said that there's been a rise in cyberbullying.
Ah,
Yeah. So again, we've got a mixed picture. But you are absolutely right. For some children who found school really difficult, the opportunity to take a break, build up learning in a different kind of way has been really powerful. And I think it's important to say that any work that parents have done with children that have developed their vocabulary and their oracy and their critical thinking and their love of learning through projects and things that the whole family can get engaged in, that actually will stand children in very good stead. And I'm particularly referencing Professor Julie Dockrell's research on the value of vocabulary and oracy in terms of attainment and lifelong chances, and in fact, mental health and well-being.
and it's particularly difficult then for the children of refugee families whose first language is not English, where their children are taught in English and they don't have the skills to be able to help their children. I mean, some of us will joke about trying to help our children with maths and actually being far worse than the child at the subject. But it's a real fear and concern for people who have anxieties about their own level of education and how little they are able to help their children because they don't understand what they're doing.
Yes, you're absolutely right. And a piece of research came out today from, I believe, the University of Sussex that looked at parental education as well as poverty in terms of the amount of education that children are getting at home. So I do think parental confidence in maths, as you say, and in fact in any subject area, I think that's absolutely a factor. And it takes us back to the widening of the gap around disadvantage. I have something reassuring though for parents of who don't speak English at home, and that's some great work from Dr. Roberto Filippi at the Institute of Education, who talks about the impact on the brain of multilinguistic families. So, if you are engaging your children in the love of learning, the excitement around ideas and oracy and vocabulary in your own language, then that still puts them in a very good place. So, it doesn't have to be English in order to be really great learning for children.
Finally, and briefly, if you would, how will the transition for these families out of lockdown be different?
I think transition is immensely important. So I just want to focus on schools, and it's all about working collaboratively with children and families. So take the child with autism who comes back and finds the scent of the hand gel really, really difficult. If that child is shouted at, then they are going to develop negative beliefs about school and has a real impact on their self-confidence and will break the relationship between school and family. If, however, the school has a conversation with the child and the family and they test out different hand gels, or they think about whether they could put the hand gel into a plate for the child or whether they could use wet wipes instead, all of that will make a difference. So it's not just a black and white picture, it's how that transition back is managed. Is it managed with care? Is it managed with compassion? And is it managed with collaboration?
Fascinating stuff there. So you're listening to Coronavirus, the Whole Story, a podcast brought to you by UCL Minds. And if there's a question about coronavirus you'd like our researchers to answer, you can email us at minds@ucl.ac.uk or tweet @UCL. And we'd also really appreciate it if you could complete our little survey, which can be found on the UCL Minds website if you haven't had a chance to do so yet. So the schools are and have been reopening, but I hate to tell everybody it's nearly time for the summer holidays. Shafina, what does this term look like for you and your students?
How much time have we got?
So not as much as we'd want, Shafina.
It's been a lot of, I think, realization, and I'm sure many parents, teachers, and educators and students would agree. I think there's been, I'm going to echo what Lee and Amelia have just said. It's not so black and white. There's been huge disparity across the country, as we know, between those who have access to, say, for example, technology, remote learning, whether it's teachers, whether it's students. There's been lots going on in the background that schools are trying to facilitate. We initially, when lockdown happened, I think, and I teach teenagers, I teach A-level, so I can speak for that age group. I think some of them are quite sort of, oh, wow, I don't have to wake up early anymore. I don't have to take the train, I'm not going to get those detentions and things like that. And they started gaming and really taking advantage of the fact that they didn't have to be in this formal structured environment. But as it's continued and we've gone back to school with social distancing in place, you just see the smiles on their faces. I mean, I'm having kids across the corridor I don't teach saying, hi miss, and it's wonderful to see. You can just see that they want to be back. They want that structure, they want that social interaction, they want to be cared for. And I teach in a London school where there are a range of different types of children that we have. Some obviously from disadvantaged families, and echoing exactly as what's been discussed already, it is those that have been hardest hit. Now, we are a tech school, so our principal has delivered laptops and dongles to families that don't have access to it, which I think has been wonderful. But I think it's a bit more deeper than that as well, in terms of, are these kids ready to take this on? How can they work out how to learn on their own? And I think that becomes a question for, are we developing resilience in our young people? Are we making them resourceful and creative about how to manage change? Now, this is a massive, massive situation that we're all going through. We've not been through anything like this. And I think at an education level, we need to have these kinds of very real conversations about, how do we really manage change? How can we be resourceful in these kinds of situations? And I've seen some of my students have really flourished in this. They're watching all these TED Talks and all these wonderful documentaries and asking me some really high level university level questions, whilst others haven't done anything for weeks. So we've had to ring home. We've got a very strong pastoral team. It's a bit of a gentle nudge rather than a push. Why aren't you doing your work? It's more, well, what's going on? How can I support? Can you get this much into me rather than all of it? How can I help you to catch up, kind of thing.
How are you preparing for the next academic year, which is coming at us very soon?
So we have obviously the social distancing and things are in place already in terms of the physical aspect. In terms of the learning aspect, we're already thinking about how to embed the what the government's called catch up. How are we going to close those gaps that have that have happened with some learners? How are we going to make sure that it's not too stressful? And I think for most of us is going to be engagement, getting the happiness back into the classroom, the love of learning back. And I think that is where the real challenge is, because some of them have really just switched off. And so I think we've got contingency plans in place should social distancing be required for the bubble side of things. But we've also looking at how do we go back as much as possible to normality, and having some structure back, and having conversations with our learners. What was it like? What was this 6 months of your life really like? So we're preparing for it at many different levels, at both mental health, as I think is going to be the biggest one, but also a very gentle sort of come back to structure. And this is the classroom environment, and the socialization aspect, I think, is going to be hugely important going forward. So we've got plans in place to do that.
So you teach A levels.
Yeah.
How are you dealing with the anxiety that teenagers are feeling about exams being cancelled and their prospects for university looking, really very insecure at the moment?
That's a really good question, and that's one that I've been actually trying to address for a while now. So my year 13s, I have drop-in calls with them on Microsoft Teams. They literally say, "Miss, can we just have a catch up?" And some of them have done. One of them's taken a job at Sainsbury's to keep himself busy. The others are reading and doing things like that. And I've said to them, "Look, we have you will go to university." Now I'm trying to be as positive as possible. You will go to university. We don't know what the grades are going to look like when they come out in August, because obviously there's been discussion already about how the predicted grades and the ranking has happened. But for some of them, I think they've just come to realize that, we'll just deal with it on results day. Some of them are quite mature in that sense, that thinking, well, this is a very new situation that nobody has really prepared for, so we can only expect the best. And some are really hopeful and saying, well, I'm going to get something. I'm really going to do it because I know I've done my absolute best this entire 2 years and I've got everything behind me. The anxiety is very real, very, very real. And I will again say what Lee was saying with the obesity. They are binge eating, they are watching Netflix till all hours, their sleep routines have gone out the window. And I think this is their response to being to the uncertainty and the anxiety. They don't quite know how to manage this. So they are resorting to eating and watching television quite a lot. So I'm trying to push, watch some good stuff, watch this, watch that, sort of directing them to something a little bit less stressful, if you like. And as I said, I think this group, the current year 13s, when they start their university programs, be it remotely or face to face, I think the universities will need to really look at how to nurture them into their programs. I don't think it's going to be one of those, here we go, lecture one, and off you go. I think there needs to be some sort of awareness and program in place to help these learners back into education in general. And that would be something really helpful for them.
So, Shafina, you've brought us actually to the towards the end of the program, and what I wanted to do to conclude this episode is acknowledge some research from a previous podcast guest, Daisy Fancourt, which showed that young people, are more anxious and stressed about the future than adults are. So, I want to ask you, all three of you now, what do you think we and our listeners who are looking after children can do to help and support young people through this time? Lee, let's start with you.
So I would say recognizing that like we did before COVID, that when people have got extreme anxiety and low mood, that's just not normal being a teenager, and that's not normal how you would respond to COVID. I think it's really important that we have the structures in place, and that families and young people can come forward to get professional help for their mental health. That's going to be so critical. We knew that the provision of care for mental health was not adequate before, and we're going to need more of it. And I think the last thing I would say, really, as emotive as it might sound, as a generation, children and young people have given up loads in COVID, and potentially, as we've talked about, that's going to have a big impact on their futures. And we've done that to children, in a sense, because of what we had to do in the national interest. So it is now profoundly in the national interest for us to emphasise the importance of basically providing what children and young people need as a country, so we can get things back on track for them.
Yes, it's curious, isn't it, that children and young people are in some ways the least affected, but the most affected. I mean,
But they've given up the most. And
yes,
I think when we look back on this, it'll be those quiet voices, children, young people who have got quieter voices because, they don't have the option to talk as much as adults do, and the elderly in care homes. It's been the quiet voices that will be one of the most powerful and hard stories to read and learn about, I think, when this is all over.
indeed. One final point from you. You've talked about mental health services really not being up to scratch before coronavirus hit. There'll be a lot of parents out there who will be worrying about the mental health of their children, who recognise that they need professional help. How on earth do they go about getting it at the moment?
Well, there will be the usual routes. I mean, the routes into it are still there. So, I mean, again, that varies from place to place, and there'll still be the routes of being able to contact your GP if they were already under a hospital. That hospital can and find ways through for them, and access to local child and adolescent mental health services. They will all be there and accessible. I think it's important to remember that we know that presentation to healthcare services for all age groups, but particularly children, has gone down significantly through COVID. So it's important that families know that those services are actually still there for them. The bigger picture is making sure that they're sustainable at a country level, and that they're invested in and that training is put in place. So I think the processes haven't changed and will still stay the same. The only thing that might be affected, of course, was that the NHS long-term plan talked about embedding mental health screening and early interventions within schools. And for me, that's a big worry because that was where a lot of the emphasis to improve mental health delivery for children and young people was going to go. And what we've just been talking about with children not being in school and the potential for that not to be back on track and lots of things to catch up on, it still needs to be part of the focus, the mental health and well-being, as part of the whole spectrum of what was going to happen before.
Amelia, what's your thoughts about this? How do we support young people through this time?
Yes, I'm so glad you asked that question. On our website, which is the UCL Centre for Inclusive Education, we have got a raft of resources that we've been collating over the last 3 months, including support on mental health, support on homeschooling, and support for transitions. And we cover everything from social stories for children with autism to visual timetables to apps around mental health. So it's a wealth of resources and they are all free to download. Additionally, it's so interesting that Lee mentioned Back on Track because we've just received funding from the Higher Education Innovation Fund to do some research into how we can support schools with helping children, particularly vulnerable children, to get back on track. It's actually called Back on Track. And part of that research will be to produce a document that will be free to download to support children and families and schools in managing that transition back to education, thinking very much about well-being as well as attainment.
Thank you. Shafina, you're absolutely at the coalface. You're in contact with uh, young people every day. What can their parents and carers do to help them?
Well, I think at school level we already, schools do have these systems in place already with safeguarding, and there's always a safeguarding officer, a delegated one at school, and I think they are going to have to face the significant impact of this and be the port of call to direct them to further things like social services and things. But what Amelia just mentioned about the wealth of resources that UCL are offering, I think that's what schools are going to look to, particularly those who don't have much experience or don't know where to look for support. So I think it's going to be for parents to contact schools as they have been doing. But I think the offering from universities and mental health specialists like UCL offering would be very, very useful because some of them are literally asking, where do I go? Who do I ask? And they're being sort of ping pong from one place to another often. So I think a big collaboration way forward would be really, really good for parents, teachers, and students alike to know that there is this big place that you can go to and there'll be lots of support available. My worry is the sustainability of it. As we know, there's been such a huge increase in reports from various different organisations on children and their welfare. So I think it's about how we can efficiently, effectively sort of reduce the time it takes for people to get support. I think that's going to be the key thing, rather than so that they don't get lost into the numbers game in the system. I think it's going to require quite a strong, clear strategy going forward.
And is there anything particular that you've seen particular parents doing that's been really helpful? I want to end on a note of positivity here.
I think parents, the ones I've at least spoken to, and in my college, have been really positive. They're taking on all the support that the school is offering, and where there are things that we can offer externally, we'll say, oh look, I will guide them to certain databases, certain information things, and it's keeping that communication going. I think that is the key thing. That how are we communicating with parents about their children, and often. They want to help, but they don't know where to look. So I think having a very strong communication with the parental community at large is going to be, I think, a very positive way forward.
Thank you so much, and thank you all of you, because it's been such an interesting discussion. And really, young people, it's such a cliche, but oh so true. Young people are our future, and I think we owe them, as you say, Lee, an enormous amount at the moment. You've been listening to Coronavirus, the Whole Story. This episode was presented by myself, Vivienne Parry, produced by UCL with support from the UCL Health of the Public and UCL Grand Challenges, and edited by the splendid Kerys Bradley. Our guests today were Dr. Lee Hudson, Dr. Amelia Roberts, and Shafina Vohra. If you'd like to hear more of these podcasts from UCL Minds, of course you would. Subscribe wherever you download your podcasts or visit ucl.ac.uk/coronavirus. And whilst you're there, don't forget that survey. This podcast is brought to you by UCL Minds, bringing together UCL knowledge, insights and expertise through events, digital content and activities open to everyone. Hope to be with you again soon.